I used to believe I could control everything. Until the night she looked back at me. My life was a structure cold stone and ancient titles, a fortress built to withstand the messy, unpredictable whims of the heart. As the Earl of Ravenwood, I was a man of logic, a man of duty, a man who viewed the world from the high, lonely windows of my study. Then came Clara. She was my maid, my duty, my sin, and from the moment she stepped in the shadow of my doorway, the stones of my fortress began to crumble, grain by agonizing grain. She arrived on a Tuesday, a day so unremarkable it should have been forgotten. I barely looked up from my ledgers when the housekeeper introduced her, a replacement for the girl who had married a blacksmith. Clara stood there, her head bowed just enough to be respectful, but her spine as straight as a soldier's. "Clara, my lord," the housekeeper said. I gave a curt nod, dismissive and cold. I was a master who demanded invisibility from his staff. I wanted my tea hot, my shirts pressed, and my silence undisturbed. I didn't want a woman with eyes like a stormy, making me wonder what thoughts lay behind her silence. But invisibility was a coat Clara refused to wear. It started with the small things, the way she arranged the books on my desk, not just by size, but by subject, as if she knew the inner workings of my mind, the way she would pause for a fraction of a second when I spoke, a hesitation that wasn't fear, but a silent judgment. She was a maid, yet she carried herself with a grace that felt like an insult to my carefully curated world. She was a ghost in my halls, the rustle of cotton that sounded like a heartbeat in the quiet of the night. I found myself watching her. It was a compulsion I couldn't quell. I watched her from the balcony as she walked through the gardens, her fingers brushing the lavender. I watched her in the dining room, her movements fluid and precise. I told myself it was because I was a perfectionist, ensuring my household ran smoothly. But deep down, in the dark corners of my soul, I refused the light. I knew it was something else. It was a hunger, a starving man staring at a feast he was forbidden to touch. "You've missed a spot, Clara," I said one evening, pointing to a perfectly clean silver tray. It was a lie, a petty, desperate attempt to make her look at me. She didn't flinch. She picked up the polishing cloth, her eyes meeting mine for the first time in weeks. "My apologies, my lord. I shall strive for perfection you so clearly lack elsewhere." The words were soft, almost a whisper, but they hit me like a physical blow. The provocation was there, sharp and glittering. I should have dismissed her on the spot. I should have sent her packing with no references. Instead, I felt a jolt of electricity so fierce it made my hands tremble. "You forget your place," I hissed, stepping closer. The scent of her, soap and something like rain, filled my senses. "And you, my lord, seem to have forgotten that your servants are made of flesh and blood, not clockwork," she replied, her voice steady. The defiance in her gaze was a challenge I wasn't prepared for. We stood there, the silence of the library stretching between us, heavy with everything we weren't saying. I was her master. She was my servant. But in the dying light of the afternoon, those titles felt like hollow shells. The weeks that followed were a slow torture. Every interaction was a duel. Every command I gave was met with a look that said she saw right through my mask. I started staying up later, drinking more brandy, try to drown out the sound of her footsteps in the hall. My sister, Augusta, began to notice. She spoke of London, of eligible heiresses, of the need for an earl to secure his legacy. But how could I think of legacies when my mind was occupied by the way Clara's hair escaped her cap? How could I think of a duchess when a maid had more fire in her pinky finger than the whole of Mayfair combined? One night, the storm I had been sensing finally broke. A torrential downpour lashed against the windows of Ravenwood, and the wind howled like a wounded beast. I was in the library, the only room that felt like mine. The door creaked open, and there she was, carrying a tray of tea I hadn't asked for. She looked damp, her apron clinging to her curves, her eyes dark with the reflection of the lightning outside. "I thought you might be cold," she said. "I am always cold, Clara. You should know that by now." I didn't look at her, focusing instead on the fire. She set the tray down and walked over to the hearth, kneeling to stoke the embers. The movement was so intimate, so domestic, it felt like a knife in my chest. "Perhaps you just need a different kind of fire," she murmured. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, the words raw and jagged. She stood up slowly, her face inches from mine. "I want nothing from you, Julian. I am a maid. I know what I am, but I also know what you are. You are a man who is terrified of feeling anything. You hide behind your titles and your rules, because you're afraid that if you let someone in, the whole world will see how hollow you feel." The truth of it burned. I reached out, my hand grasping her arm, not with violence, but with a desperate, drowning need. "You know nothing of me," I whispered, even as I pulled her closer. "I know the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching," she countered, her breath hot against my skin. "I know the way your voice changes when you say my name. You think you're the master, but you're a prisoner of your own making." I couldn't take it anymore. The distance, the lies, the crushing weight of my own restraint, it all shattered. I leaned down, my lips crashing against hers in a kiss that was less of a romance and more surrender. It was a confession of every secret I had kept, every desire I had buried. She tasted like tea and rebellion, and for the first time in my life, the cold inside me vanished. I wasn't an earl in that moment. I wasn't a master. I was a man, finally, terrifyingly alive. But even as I held her, as the firelight danced on the walls, I felt the first pang of guilt. I was ruining her. I was ruining myself. The world would never allow this. We were a scandal waiting to happen, a tragedy written in the stars. And yet, as she wrapped her arms around my neck, pulling me deeper into the abyss, I knew I would do it all again. I would burn my house down just to keep her warm for a single night. The morning after was a descent back into reality. The sun was too bright, the birds too loud. I saw her in the hallway, her head down, the perfect maid once again. But as she passed, she whispered, "Tonight," a single word that promised heaven and threatened hell. I spent the day in a daze, fulfilling my duties with a heart that was no longer in my chest. I met with my solicitor. I answered letters. I even endured a visit from a vicar. All the while, the memory of her touch was a brand on my skin. I began to realize that my power was an illusion. I gave the orders, but she held the strings. I was a master by day, but after midnight, I was a supplicant at her feet. We began to meet in secret, in the old greenhouse, in the servants' quarters, in the shadows of the gallery. Each time was a gamble, a frantic race against the dawn. Our conversations grew deeper, our provocations more daring. She told me of her dreams, of a life beyond service, of a world where she could be more than just a pair of hands. And I told her the loneliness of my position, the burden of a name that felt like a shroud. "You could leave," she said one night, as we lay hidden in the hayloft of the stables. "We could go where no one knows us." "And live on what, Clara? My title means nothing without the land. My money is tied to the estate." "Then you are truly a prisoner," she said, her voice tinged with pity. It stung more than any insult. I wanted to prove her wrong. I wanted to show her I was brave enough to choose her over everything else. But the ghost of my father and his father before him stood in my way. I was the Earl of Ravenwood. I had a duty to the bloodline. And she was a girl with nothing but a sharp tongue and a heart that made mine beat again. The days that followed were a dangerous dance on a blade of glass. At breakfast, I felt Clara's gaze as she served the fruit, a heat that pierced through the fine linen of my coat. In the afternoon, the sound of her distant laughter with the other maids in the garden sounded like a wrong note in a perfect symphony, or perhaps the only right note. I was becoming a stranger in my own home. Every rule of etiquette I enforced on others felt like a hypocrisy that suffocated me. "Your tea, my lord." "2 lumps of sugar, as you prefer," she said, while I pretended to read an urgent piece of correspondence. The room was empty, the heavy velvet curtains blocking the cold Norfolk wind. "What I prefer, Clara, is something not found in a silver pot," I replied, without looking up. I heard the sound of the porcelain being placed on the table. She did not withdraw. Preference is a luxury of free men, Julian. An earl has obligations. A maid has a schedule. Neither of us truly owns what we desire. I finally looked at her. She stood there, hands folded over her pristine white apron, but her eyes, they sparkled with that sharp intelligence that disarmed me. "Are you challenging me again? In my own library?" "No," she said, taking a step closer, enough for me to see the hurried rise and fall of her chest. "I am reminding you that time is passing. Lady Augusta has already ordered the invitations for the autumn ball. She plans to display her prize to every eligible bachelorette in the county." The mention of the ball made my stomach tighten. I would have to dance with women whose names I barely remembered, while the woman I craved would be in the shadows, pouring wine for my guests. The injustice of it hit me with physical force. I stood up, rounding the desk with a swiftness that made her recoil slightly. "And what if I don't want to be a prize?" I asked, my voice a dangerously low growl. "What if I prefer the company of the one who calls me by my name when the lights go out?" Clara smiled, a sad smile that broke my heart. "Then you would be a brave man. But the world does not tolerate courage that comes from the bottom up, my lord. They would call it a scandal. And me, they would call me something much worse." I pulled her to me, feeling the initial resistance that soon dissolved into surrender. The kiss was bitter, seasoned with the despair of those who know they are building a castle in the sand. That afternoon, between the oak shelves and the scent of leather, I promised myself I wouldn't let her go. But the promise of a man in love is often a lie he tells himself just to get some sleep. A thick fog swallowed Ravenwood Hall, as if nature itself were trying to hide our sins. But the fog couldn't hide the truth from my sister. Augusta was no fool. She noticed the way my eyes followed Clara. She noticed the way Clara's hand lingered when she handed me a glass. "You are playing with fire, Julian. Augusta whispered to me in the drawing room, her voice sharp as a needle. "That girl is a servant. If you ruin her, it's a He looks like you," she said, not turning around. "Stern, honorable, completely alone." "He didn't have a Clara," I said, standing behind her, my breath ghosting over her neck. "He had a duty," she countered. "And so do you." She turned in my arms, her expression fierce. "The housekeeper is suspicious. They are talking in the village. This cannot last, Julian. The master cannot keep the maid in his heart without the world tearing them both apart." "Then let it tear," I whispered, my hands finding the curve of her waist. "Let the world burn, as long as I can hold you in the ashes." The provocation turned into a desperate hunger. I led her to my bedchamber, a room she had entered 1,000 times to clean, but never to stay. In the dark, the hierarchy vanished completely. Every touch was an act of rebellion, every moan a defiance of the bloodline. She was my maid by day, but in the heat of the night, she was my queen, my tormentor, and my only truth. But as the clock struck 3, I saw the fear in her eyes. We were living on borrowed time, and the debt was about to fall due. My sister's threats weren't empty, and the society I belonged to was a monster that didn't like to be mocked. I realized then that I couldn't just love her in the dark. I had to find a way to bring her into the light, or I would lose her forever to the shadows of Ravenwood. The inevitable collision arrived on the night of the autumn ball. The house was a swarm of silken ego, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and desperation. I moved through the ballroom like a ghost, shaking hands I didn't want to hold, smiling at women I didn't want to see. My eyes, however, were constantly searching the periphery. I saw her. Clara was dressed in her best uniform, standing by the refreshment table, her face a mask of professional indifference. But our eyes met for a fleeting second, and in that glance I saw the shared agony of our distance. Lady Penelope was draped on my arm, her voice a high-pitched chirping about the merits of Italian marble. "Don't you agree, Julian?" she asked, batting her lashes. "I agree that beauty is often found in the most unexpected places," I replied, my gaze drifting toward the servant in the corner. Penelope's smile faltered, her sharp eyes following my look. She wasn't a fool. She saw the electricity that crackled in the air between the Earl and the maid. The scandal broke an hour later. My sister, Augusta, had cornered Clara in the pantry, accusing her of theft, a desperate, clumsy attempt to have her dismissed and disgraced before the night was over. I found them there, the kitchen staff huddled in the shadows, Augusta pointing a trembling finger at a silver locket that Clara supposedly stole. "She is a thief, Julian. She must be handed to the magistrate immediately." Augusta's voice was triumphant. Clara stood her ground, her chin tilted high, though her eyes were glassy with tears. "I have stolen nothing but the air I breathe in this house," she said, her voice echoing with a dignity that silenced the room. I stepped into the center of the fray. The moment of truth had arrived. The fortress of my life was about to fall, and for the first time I was ready to watch it burn. "She did not steal it, Augusta," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I gave it to her, along with my heart." The silence that followed was deafening. Augusta's face turned a ghostly white. The staff gasped. Penelope, who had followed me, stood in the doorway with her mouth agape. I walked to Clara, taking her hand, reddened from work, yet softer than any silk, and interlaced my fingers with hers. "Julian, you are mad. Augusta whispered, "You will lose everything. The title, the respect of the ton, your standing in this county. You will be an outcast." "Then I shall be a very happy outcast," I replied. I looked at Clara, seeing the shock and the burgeoning hope in her eyes. "I am tired of being a master of shadows, Clara. I want to be the man who stands beside you in the sun." We left that night, not as master and servant, but as two people who had found the courage to be honest. I resigned my seat. I settled the estate on my cousin, and I took what was mine, a small inheritance and the woman who had saved my soul. We moved to a small coastal town in Cornwall, where the air smells of salt and freedom. I am no longer an earl. I am a man who works with his hands, who writes poetry that no one but his wife reads. And Clara, she is no longer a maid. She is the fire at my hearth and the light in my world. Sometimes after midnight, when the moon is high over the sea, I look at her and remember the cold stone of Ravenwood. I remember the silence and the duty, and then I reach for her, and she trembles in my arms just as she did that first night. I used to believe I could control everything, but I was wrong. I was controlled by fear. Now, I am governed only by her. It was a scandal that ruined my name, but it was the only thing that ever truly made me a man. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It truly helps us bring you more tales of love, betrayal, and destiny. And if your heart still craves more, explore the other stories waiting for you here. You might just find your next obsession.